I think I'll just start welcoming everybody. We're just waiting for everyone to arrive, but welcome everyone. We'll just give a couple of minutes for everyone to get in and get settled. And while we're waiting, we just have a couple of thoughts for reflection for you to be thinking about as everyone arrives. We've just got some questions, so you don't have to answer these questions out loud or type anything in the chat. This is just a few thoughts for you to be thinking about, and we'll address some of these things throughout today's workshop. And hopefully, if we run to schedule, we'll return to some of these thoughts and maybe have the opportunity to chat a bit about them at the end. So just have a look through, just a moment of quiet reflection while everyone arrives, and then we'll begin. Okay, I think everyone's here, but a couple of people might just arrive later. So I just want to welcome you and for taking the time to come to our workshop today on supporting ethnic minority students on placement. And we're really happy to see so many people who wanted to come today. It's really pleasing to see. So we'll just get straight on, and I'll give you an overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to be here for a couple of hours, and you can use the chat function as we go along if you've got any questions, and we'll find opportunities to address any questions that you've got. So if you've got anything you want to type into the chat, then we'll be keeping an eye on that. But there will be opportunities throughout the next couple of hours for you to get into small groups and discuss. So it'll be quite interactive. So you'll have opportunities for discussion as well as being able to pop any questions you've got into the chat. If you've got any technical issues today, if it kicks you out, please just try get back on the link. It should just let you back in if it kicks you out. So we've left, there's no waiting room anymore, so you should be able to just come straight back in if for any reason it kicks you out unexpectedly. Okie dokie. Let me just give you an overview of what we're going to be covering today. So first of all, we're going to be giving you an overview of some research that we've been conducting. We'll talk to you about why we set out to do that research, how we did it, and what the findings were, and perhaps most importantly, what the recommendations for the research is. And you'll have the opportunity to see the full report on that research, which we'll send to you directly after today's session. Then we'll have a bit of a breakout exercise and opportunity for you to discuss recommendations of your own, what you think might work, and feedback on that in small groups. And then we have Nikki talking about her personal experiences of being on placement. Nikki's not able to join us live today, but we have pre-recorded a conversation between Nikki and Polly, which will be really interesting. And then we've got Shalicia, who's joining us today to talk about practice what you teach. So I'm really grateful to Shalicia for being here. And finally, we'll finish with ways that you can take this further, things that you can get involved in with us, what we're going to be doing next, and things that you can sign up to help us with. I'll just give you an overview of who's involved in today. Sorry, Polly, I've gone out of order. But here's the research group. You'll be able to see us on the screens at some point. It's me, Kelly Devenny, Hannah Jobling, Polly Sykes, and Jenny Frelfall. You can give a wave if you like, guys, from the University of York, and Emma Geddes from Leeds Beckett University. We also have Janet Cox and Shalicia Ward from our consultation group. Thank you so much for being here today. You'll be taking part as well. And Cleo was part of our consultation group, but isn't able to join us today, but we wanted to give a little shout out. And as I mentioned, Nikki, there'll be a video of her personal experience. So we're really grateful to Nikki for taking the time to record that, even though she couldn't be here today. Okay, so that's how it's going to go. That's it from me. I can't remember who I'm handing over to, but off we go.
Janet and Polly.
Janet and Polly, thanks.
Yes, hello. Well, when we started doing the research, we'd had some discussions between the university and partners, so I'm from North Yorkshire County Council, about what seemed to be some issues for Black students, international students, minority ethnic students, that the local and the national picture was that they were more likely to have struggles, more likely to have action plans, more likely to fail a placement. And we had a meeting a couple of years ago now that involved the North East Teaching Partnership that was there at the time. And we felt on discussion there was enough to warrant a piece of research. And alongside that, North Yorkshire County Council started to have a look within our social work practice education team about what we did and how we did it. So it's an ongoing progress. I think we didn't just wait until the research came out. We assumed there was enough there anecdotally, but we were very pleased to be invited to collaborate with the research. And it's still a journey, I think, that we're all going along. So we've got more awareness, we're adjusting policies, tools, but obviously we do need support and advice from all our colleagues across the region. And yeah, I think that's probably a summary of where we were at when we started and why we did it. Thank you.
Okay, so what we wanted to do with this piece of research, our aims and objectives, it was funded by the University's Widening Participation Fund. And we wanted to understand, in light of kind of what Janet said about what would come up in the teaching partnership, and also in light of other research that's been done kind of nationally, about what challenges student social workers might experience, particularly minority ethnic student social workers might experience on placement, and to consider how we might be able to address any disparities between students' experiences. We also wanted to find out about barriers to learning and facilitators, or anything that practice educators might already be using that they might find particularly useful with minority ethnic students on placement. So we wanted to talk to a diverse kind of group of people, so students, newly qualified social workers, practice educators, and university staff as well, who are involved in supporting students on their placements. And then we wanted to share knowledge, which is what we're doing today via this webinar, but also feed into training of practice educators and kind of future development for practice educators. So our research design was kind of flexible, particularly in the light of COVID. So originally we planned to do focus groups with everyone, that turned into individual interviews. I think we did our last focus group on the day before we went into national lockdown. So we spoke to 18 practice educators, and some of those were in focus groups and some were individually via telephone interviews. We spoke to 3 university staff who were involved in supporting students on placement in a focus group. And then we also spoke to 5 students or newly qualified minority ethnic students or social workers who were interviewed individually via telephone. And then we kind of did the analysis and collated all the information to get to the research findings.
Okay, so now we're just going to move on to the findings, some of the main findings from the research, and I'm just going to kind of run through the key themes that we found from our interviews with students and practice educators and university liaisons. So kind of to set the context a little bit here, one of the main things to sort of say really was the issues, kind of broad issues around possibly like a lack of diversity within the region in terms of demographics, demographically being not especially diverse, and the recognition of this and the impact that this might have for students who were working in a majority white setting. And I've got a couple of quotes here, one from a practice educator and one from a student, and practice educator empathizing there and saying, it is quite difficult, coming into a team where actually there isn't that sense that, that there's maybe that sense of not sharing that kind of ethnic background and what that might mean for a student. And, students, it's a common sort of theme through our interview with students was like anxiety, I think, about going into placement settings and feeling like, oh, are we going to be welcome or not? And what people's attitudes going to be and so on. And obviously it's really nerve-wracking, as we all know, as you'll all know as practice educators as well. It's always nerve-wracking for students coming into placement for the first time and kind of developing that sense of belonging. I think, for students from different ethnic backgrounds, that could sort of be an additional maybe source of anxiety for them. And also one thing that came up again, very common in the interviews with practice educators and with the students, was experiences of racism from people who use the service. This could be quite direct and overt racism at times, or it could be feel a little bit more covert. you know, in terms of students just getting a sense from the people that they were working with, individuals they were working with, that that individual didn't feel comfortable working with them. And, you know, this practice educator kind of sums it up in it saying, you know, we know that students are highly likely to encounter racism on placement, and obviously that raises an additional challenge for both students and practice educators. You know, for some practice educators, you know, a lack of exposure to working with students from ethnically diverse backgrounds meant that they felt maybe a little bit inexperienced and were unsure about how to manage that, which I'll come on to in the next slide. But there was a common view of practice educators that they'd really appreciate a bit more training and professional development activities around issues of race, ethnicity and diversity. And the final sort of issue here was, you know, thinking about racism within the community from the people we work with, but also racism, experiencing kind of racism from other professionals. And this could be kind of quite subtle forms of othering from professionals that maybe aren't intentional, but would still cause a kind of sense of exclusion. And, you know, as practice educators reflecting on a student they'd supported where, you know, there were questions being asked about them and they were wondered where those questions were coming from. And, you know, students talked to us, for example, about getting mixed up with other students or not having their name kind of used correctly. You know, this isn't about necessarily within teams, but also working with professionals, practitioners from, you know, other agencies and other settings. Okay, Polly. So, you know, talking to practice educators, so, you know, it's a really broad recognition that there was a need to challenge racism and to protect and support students. And oftentimes practice educators would talk about, you know, checking in with students, providing emotional kind of pastoral support to them in situations where they might have experienced racism, you know, and also gently sort of challenging the views, particularly of service users who kind of came with racist attitudes. But there was also a range of views and uncertainty in how to kind of support students and how to challenge racism as well. You know, there's a common theme there that, you know, there's obviously when we engage with people in the communities that we're working with, there can be complexities within that. And a common theme, I think, in this discussion was those tensions that exist in social work, where, you know, we often have a duty to provide services regardless of what an individual's views are, and you know, where when we talk about effective social work, that's often based on kind of thinking about relationship building, strengths-based approaches, things like that. So and working especially with individuals who maybe don't welcome social work involvement as well, and the trickiness of obviously trying to kind of engage and maintain relationships with those individuals could mean that challenging racism could be seen as particularly complex. And, you know, as practice educator kind of came with one perception that came out of this was that, you know, this is the kind of reality of practice and they're going to have to deal with it, students are going to have to deal with it. But in the other sense, this kind of sense of, is that good enough, you know, for us to expect students to have to deal with that. And I think the issue here wasn't necessarily about practice educators, but about the organisational support and guidance that was there for practice educators to feel like they and their team could offer effective responses to racism. So, you know, not just thinking about, well, what do practice educators do as individuals, but what were the kind of policies and procedures in place to support them. And practice educators reported feeling quite hampered often by a lack of awareness or, you know, a lack of clear policies on this. And this was potentially an issue, some practice educators talked about this being an issue for the whole profession rather than just for students. So some practice educators made comparisons between the zero tolerance policy operating within other organisations such as the NHS and the lack of similar policies sometimes in statutory social work institutions. And they really expressed the need for clear organisational guidance. And where practice educators had been able to provide an effective response, this was often when they'd had strong institutional guidance and proactive support from managers. So some practice educators also reflected on how they could have better supported students. And one kind of thing that came out from that was this sense of being proactive from the beginning of the placement and discussing how racism could be dealt with kind of from the start, rather than placing the onus on students to report issues when they arose. So one practice educator kind of reflected back and said, you know, it would have been good if I could have been the person who'd instigated that conversation. You know, I felt like she was kind of sussing out how safe it was to raise an issue because she'd had a previous issue in a workplace. So on reflection, I think that shouldn't have been her responsibility, that should have been something I was doing. And I think we did get a sense from students that there was a bit of wariness about approaching racism and wondering, you know, what would happen if they did report racism, and feeling that people didn't necessarily know the best way of responding. So kind of moving on from thinking about racism and thinking more broadly about how we acknowledge difference and identity in placements. Practice educators had an understandable desire to treat students equally, and also there was a little bit of anxiety there around directly addressing difference, you know, not wanting to make a song and a dance of it. And this kind of connects back to what I was just saying about sometimes having those helpful conversations about dealing with racism or discriminatory experiences from the start. But if you're taking that kind of view that, you know, it's not possible to address it from the beginning because you want to treat students the same, then it's not necessarily easy to have those kinds of conversations. And I think this practice educator was reflecting on that when they were sort of saying, you know, in the past we've pretended it isn't an issue and we're colourblind, but that isn't particularly helpful because we do actually need to address it. And there's a question there, you know, what are the best ways of addressing that? So when practice educators talked about how they did explore questions of identity, they talked about kind of, and there was an emphasis here on kind of what the student's identity was and student reflection, but not necessarily thinking in mutual terms about how do we reflect together about our identities, and acknowledge that we all have a cultural identity and ethnic identity. Some practice educators use particular techniques and models for discussing issues around difference, power dynamics, and what power dynamics that could bring up. So, you know, this often took place obviously through supervisory work. You know, things like the Mandela model that I know has been disseminated in North Yorkshire, and some practice educators made reference to using the social graces model, for example, as well, to have those kinds of conversations, which they found helpful and was something that they could use mutually with students to do that kind of joint reflection. So thinking about identity in the sense of belonging as well, issues of kind of race and ethnicity can be acknowledged really clearly and positively in partnership with students as part of these kinds of discussions on identity and power. But the other side of that is that where there's an emphasis on identity, which can be experienced as alienating, and this was discussed in our interviews in relation to questions of culture and cultural differences. And there were some assumptions made by some university liaisons and, you know, some practice educators about student capabilities, and this raised an issue, I suppose a theme within interviews around you know, deficit approaches to students versus strengths-based approaches. You know, a deficit approach focused primarily on the issues and challenges in relation to values and skills, for example, particularly communication. You know, things like eye contact, for example, or how much students were kind of taking part in team conversations and things like that, as opposed to a strengths-based approach, which would consider cultural backgrounds as a kind of positive attribute to the work. And it's important to acknowledge that where students talked about positive experiences of placement, and excellent support from practice educators, teams and organisations, that was really connected to this sense of feeling welcomed and a sense of belonging with the team and being made to feel at home. But also some students talked in the other side of that, of feeling quite isolated and self-conscious at times, which could then reinforce perceptions of kind of cultural difference, you know, kind of feeling that they were withdrawing from other people within the team because of that kind of self-consciousness. It's also important to kind of talk about how kind of a student's ethnic background would position her within a team. So for example, some students talked about taking on a bit of a cultural expert role within their team, which created a certain amount of ambivalence. Whilst for some students this was a positive experience because it allowed them to share aspects of their culture with colleagues who were really interested, it could also feel a little bit uncomfortable at times and place an additional strain on students to educate others about their background. And a practice educator talks about this, you know, the team wanting her to be this kind of expert. And there were stories shared by practice educators and students of students being questioned a lot about culture and religious beliefs. And this could accentuate them feeling, you know, being made to feel different. And also being asked sort of questions that you think, you know, for example, practice educator talked about a student being asked about if being asked by a colleague about, oh, do you need to ask a man before you're allowed to do something? You know, the student was Muslim, and kind of an assumption being made about what that student would and wouldn't be able to do. And so there was an emphasis here on kind of them rather than a particular culture that was already there within a team. So that's the kind of main findings that we kind of came out of the research. And I'm going to hand over to Jenny now, who's going to talk about some of the recommendations that have come out of those findings.
Thank you, Hannah. So yes, of course, we've found out all this really interesting stuff from the students, the social workers that we talked with. But the big question is, of course, what do we do about it all? So we have come up with some recommendations, some suggestions of what could be done about these findings. For us as higher education providers, for placement organisations, and for you guys as practice educators. So firstly, for us as the university. So one thing that we want to commit to is to providing training and resources for you as practice educators. And those are resources around anti-racist approaches, and thinking how you can really use those in your practice education is we train students together. Another thing that we're going to talk about more as we go on through this webinar is we're looking to establish some book groups where we're going to look together at narratives that have been put together by minority ethnic authors. But I'm going to set that aside right now because we're going to talk about that more a little bit later. I also want to emphasise that we have made a lot more recommendations for the university and for us as people who work within the university, for the way we teach, the way that we do research, and for wider policies within the university. I'm not going to go into all those now because they're kind of not interesting, but they are very important. If you are interested in reading more about those, we're going to send you out our final report from this project where you can read more of those in detail. Okay, so recommendations for placement providers. So, firstly, to develop guidance for how we should respond when students experience racism and discrimination. As Hannah mentioned, you know, students do experience discrimination on placement, and often they just don't know what to do about it. So those specific policies of what happens when that occurs need to be in place. And we need to ensure that students know what those policies are in advance, so that when unfortunately these events do happen, they're not left scrambling around wondering what on earth they should do. They know what those policies are in advance. And another recommendation is that placement providers should be providing continuing professional development opportunities that specifically refer to anti-racism, and that those should be available not only for staff, but they should also be available for students while they're on placement. And finally, some recommendations for practice educators and for university staff. Now, I do want to just emphasise here that most of the recommendations we've made have been at the structural, at the organisational level. We really firmly believe, as a result of this research, that that's where change needs to happen. But of course, there are things that we can be doing as individuals. And some of those are what we've got on this slide here. So firstly, as individuals, we can all be taking every opportunity we can to learn about race, about culture, and about diversity. And of course, that's one of those things that we're all doing by being here. We can explore our own race and our own identity. Now, I'm speaking here as a white person. Often, as white people, we don't think that's important for us, but we all have race, we all have ethnicity. This is something that's important for us all to be doing. We can all be exploring how our own race impacts students' placement experiences. So that's our own race, but also how the students' race impacts their placement experiences. It's important that we're having those discussions. And we can also adopt an explicitly strengths-based approach. So that means looking for the strengths in who they are as a person, not just in their race, their ethnicity and culture, but in all parts of their intersectional identity. Okay, so with those recommendations in mind, I am now going to hand over to Polly, who's going to explain to us what we're going to do in our breakout groups.
Hi everyone, so we've got 3 questions for you, starting with what are the barriers to meeting these recommendations? And what are the barriers more generally to practicing anti-oppressively, really? So what stops you, whether it's about you as an individual, whether it's about the organisation, whether it's about a knowledge gap or anything like that? Then the second question is, how might you or us or your organisation address those barriers or go some way towards addressing those barriers? And then finally, top tips to each other, top tips to us. What have you found useful? What has really worked, either in terms of a direct exercise that you've done with a student, a piece of training you've done, something you've read, whatever it is, or throw in all those top tips. So in a moment, Emma's going to put some group links in the chat. You will, whichever, you're going to be in one of 4 breakout rooms. So if you're in breakout room 1, then follow the link that Emma's put in for group 1, obviously. And that will take you to a Padlet that we've set up. That Padlet has these 3 questions on, because what we want you to do is make a few notes so that afterwards we can share this knowledge and your kind of discussions with each other, with all of you. There is a 4th question, and I'm going to ask you not to look at those because that's for a later exercise. Choose a spokesperson, because we are going to ask for a bit of feedback, but we're not going to ask for a lot of feedback. So try to make the notes that you take really self-explanatory. We really just want 1 or 2 highlights maximum. We don't have a huge amount of time to talk about everything you've observed, but any standout observations would be really good. We've got until, we've got about 20 minutes for this actually, so you can combine it with a quick refreshment break if you need one as well. But yeah, if you can get together in those groups, I think that Hannah's or Jenny is putting you in those groups now.
Yes, so I've assigned everybody to one of the 4 groups. In a moment, I'm going to click to send you to the groups. I'm not sure if everybody's used Zoom breakout rooms before. What's going to happen is after I've sent you to the groups, it'll ask you if you want to join, just click yes, and you'll be sent automatically to the group where you'll be joining with 4 or 5 other people. When time is nearly up, we'll give you a warning that it's nearly time to come back, and then you'll be brought automatically back to the main room.
Brilliant, thanks everyone for that. So I'm going to share my screen again in a moment, and I've got a little segment that's been recorded just earlier today with Nikita. Nikita's an ex-student of ours. She's from a minority ethnic background and she's also disabled, so she's got both of those things going on for her, which of course compound sometimes her experience. So The segment I'm going to show you was part of a slightly longer conversation where she also talked about her experience of her needs not being accommodated, or where they were accommodated as well. So just bearing that in mind, because she refers back a couple of times. And what I've done is, because time was limited, I've skipped to her what works segment. So I'm just going to share screens now. Hold on a moment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hide my self-view in a moment so that you can focus on Nikki, and Nikki's going to talk a little bit about her experience. Hi, Nikki.
Hi everyone. So thank you for having me today, and I'm going to share a little bit about my lived experience whilst on placement, how it went, how I managed to get through my placement pass, and some of the takeaways and learning experiences I had along the way. So one of the biggest factors that helped in becoming successful in the placement and challenging these overall assumptions and sweeping statements, as I've alluded to earlier, was using supervision effectively, bringing material to discuss that was under the PCF and learning goals for students, such as bringing in work that where I could evidence that I've done reflection on my values of ethics and power structures within the social work placement, and how I could then bring in my own individual differences and my points of references. And this really helped embed my learning in how students should be aware of different aspects of the PCF in terms of social justice, in terms of rights, in terms of values, ethics, power. But it also gave me the opportunity to talk to my practice educator about where I was in terms of my point of reference, what I believed in, what parts of my background I subscribed to and what parts I didn't. And it was through bringing this material together and having these discussions that were very much rooted in social work education practice, but also had that element of challenging, these perspectives that my educator had. We grew to mutually have a lot more respect for each other, and acceptance grew, because as we were both learning, as she was learning from myself in terms of where I saw myself with positionality and where I saw myself as a practitioner going forward with all of the learning about the PCF and other knowledge gained from the practice of learning the social work profession, we developed almost a co-production, a better understanding of each other's point of reference clearly, and we were able to understand better where we were coming from. The other aspect, and unfortunately, sad to say, but the other aspect that worked but only came to light after I was put on an action plan was being listened and asked what I needed from the placement, because although I voiced what I needed and what I wanted at the start of placement, this was actively dismissed, and I was very much told, like I said above, that I wouldn't be successful if I needed all those accommodations of reasonable hours, support in placement, both physical and technological. But once I got put on the action plan and SMART goals were identified, I finally found that my practice educator has started to listen and attend to these needs and have more of an open mindset. And this is one of the integral parts that I feel needs to be introduced earlier, rather than waiting until an action plan to do SMART goals and understand what's important to the student. I feel this should be done early in the induction stages and actually have a written, somewhat informal, agreement between yourself as the practice educator and the student about what it is that needs to be achieved, what does the practitioner need to be aware of, and what responsibility does the student need to take on. The other thing that worked for me was having joint conversations with the practice educator and the university liaison together, and discussing other support and its involvement, such as mental health support, physical support, as in getting note takers from the university side of things to then support me on placement, getting my equipment sorted and available to me. For example, one of the equipment adjustments was to have a wheelchair table sourced and fitted for me so that I could read the notes when I was going on placement. I could balance the ring binder with the notes on to read on individual clients, and that was something I really needed, because prior to that I didn't have the ability to safely get the notes and read them and keep them confidential with many other aspects. So it's having those joint conversations and that almost multidisciplinary approach to even while a student's on placement, if they need that reasonable adjustment, or they need considerations due to cultural aspects, such as the Muslim student I mentioned above, that they might need that reasonable adjustment to go and pray, or they might need to have the placement aware that they are fasting, to be, you know, aware that they might have dips in energy levels. So it's having that awareness at the start. Another takeaway was that I, as a student, took on the initiative to speak to BAME and disabled employees within the council and online and through other networks to see what worked for them whilst they were training in their various aspects of work, both within the social work profession and outside of the social work profession, to see what would work, to see what I could reflect on and bring to my sessions myself. And then the other aspect that worked was having lots of self-reflection and through using reflection models such as Gibbs and exploring my own coping mechanisms and gently pushing myself to try and achieve as much as I could independently, but within what I could manage, given all the other aspects that worked. So then I'm going to move forward slightly and talk about the takeaways, tips and pieces of advice I would say going forward. The biggest thing I would say is educate yourself on issues on race, culture, ethnicity, intersectionality, identity, and the various other aspects through CPD and through some of the guidance the university has already outlined in their recommendations from this research. But also, don't be afraid to reach out to your BAME colleagues, whether that's through LinkedIn, through Social Work Tutor, the group online, or through your own networks within the various settings that you're in. See if they will allow you to shadow them, talk to them about their lived experience, how opt to try and go and shadow in more diverse teams. Just really try to understand the experiences from those who have direct experience and lived experience, because as much as book learning and training is the foundation of understanding a different perspective, it needs to be built on by hearing the voices of those with lived experience to truly comprehend the complexities of these matters. Be open to learning together, also with your students, you know, use it as an active process for both for yourselves as practice educators and for the student. This will help to break down power dynamics and help you both feel like equals in this learning development, you know, process. It will enrich the experience for both of you. Ask the individual what matters most to them with their ask the individual what matters most to them, what their point of reference is. Do not assume because you have met an individual from a similar background that they will be exactly the same and appreciate individual difference. Do not expect students to always educate you or the team on BAME issues. After all, the student you are working with may not feel that they can speak on behalf of the entire spectrum of lived experiences and the BAME group as a whole. Because many of us have been grouped under this title, we already sometimes feel like we are othered, and I don't feel it's particularly helpful for someone like myself who's from a South Asian perspective, speaking speaking on issues relating to Black students, for example. Be supportive if the student has intersectional experiences that need accommodation and support. Allow them to have access to whatever support they may need to be at their best when on placement, and liaise if and when needed with others. That includes the university, any personal support that the individual may have, because for myself, I had to accommodate a lot of care needs within my time on placement as well. So be open to that and, you know, facilitate that where you can. And lastly, become an ally. This is important for those with no experience or identification with these aspects or experiences, because this does not mean that you have to be an activist or get political. It just means fostering a relationship with students that allow them to view you and the time that you spend with them in supervision to be a safe space where their voices, perspectives and needs are held and supported. Because if we don't challenge our views as practitioners and as social workers, how can we, and challenge our own prejudices and thoughts and assumptions, how can we then hope to build a social work profession that enables us to support our clients in a truly holistic way without judgment or prejudice? Thank you very much.
I'm going to hand over to Shalisha for the next section. I've just got to share my screen again with the...
Thank you, Polly. Hello, everybody. So as you know, I'm Shalisha Ward. I'm a lecturer at Leeds Beckett, and I have delivered this with some of my colleagues, just looking at taking a reflexive approach to the way that we work with students from Black and minority ethnic groups. So because I was part of the research advisory team, I was asked to come and do this with yourself. So thank you for having me, and I hope that we can work together to try and further the discussions that you were just having slightly earlier in the groups. There's going to be another opportunity to go into those groups. So we, as social workers, we ascribe to being reflective practitioners, but what I'm asking people to do is to go beyond reflection and to go to reflexivity. And so that's acknowledging where we are and the space. So acknowledging that we are in a Eurocentric society. Everything is based on white being normal. The majority of us have been educated in a Eurocentric system. So we've been to school here and we have done our further and higher education here also. And our academic content and sources are often from a very Eurocentric perspective. So that means what we think is the correct way to practice is from the lens of a white person, white middle class often, and often male as well. And that isn't representative of the people that we're talking about today, which are BAME students, BME students. And it's not always representative of some of our service users either. And to be reflexive is to recognize where we stand in that. So it's to recognize, okay, I am in a white space. I am teaching somebody to put their learning into practice in a very white space. And if you yourself are white, it's important that you recognize what your whiteness brings in terms of the fact that your lived experience will be very different to the experience of the student that you're working with. And I know a lot of students are asked to reflect, and especially if you are the other, let's say, you're asked to reflect on how your otherness is going to impact your learning. But as practice educators, how often do we reflect on who we are as individuals, on how that might impact the learning of our students? So how often do we look at, okay, if I'm a white practice educator and I have a Black student, how might my whiteness impact their ability to speak openly? How might the power imbalances that exist in society have impacted that student previously? And how might that impact the way that they relate to me? And so in return, what do I need to do to kind of negate those impacts? So just acknowledging and being open about the starting point that we're at is really important. So one of our many roles is to help students develop their critical thinking and analysing skills, yeah? And we want them to put those into practice. But as practice educators, we can often become consciously competent at doing social work, and we don't necessarily always practice the things that we are expecting our students to model and display in the same way towards the student. So often what I find is that practice educators might be really good social workers towards their clients. But if you think about the social work values and ethics, it's about anti-oppressive practice towards everybody in society, not just our service users. It's about being an advocate for social justice to everybody. And in that, our BAME students are requiring that same service. So how do we model communication skills to students who are from different backgrounds to us? How do we recognise? So I'll give you a classic example. I use this all the time. When many years ago, early in practice, I was working with an Asian student and I was reprimanding him for his behaviour. And in my culture, in my Black household, I was brought up in a Caribbean household, to show respect was to give somebody eye contact. And he was not giving me eye contact, and I found that really frustrating. And I was like, look at me when I'm speaking to you, and demanding that he looked at me, and he was really, really reserved and didn't want to do that. And I finished telling him off, etc., etc. And when he left, another member of staff said to me, "Oh, Shalicia, he was actually showing you respect, because in his culture, to look down when somebody who's in authority or older than you is speaking to you is a sign of submission and respect." And I had totally been ignorant to that. I didn't understand that. And so I really, really try to recognize and understand, what does it mean in your culture to show respect? How do you show respect? And we start those dialogues. So those communication skills that we talk about in when we're studying to be social workers, our body language and all those things, it's really important that we use those, we put them to good use, and we ask open questions, and we share appropriate information about ourselves to build relationships. Because often as a practice educator, because you're in power, sometimes it can feel to students as though the questions that are being asked, and if they give the wrong answer, that they'll be in trouble. Whereas actually using your communication skills and sharing appropriate information about yourself can break down barriers right at the beginning. And I know it's been one more thing to say about communication skills is one of the most important things about communicating with people is showing them respect. And often what we find, or what I've heard students talk about, is somebody asking them to give them an alternative name to call them by, to be able to find it easier to speak to them, because their name is not a name that they're familiar with. And that's really disrespectful, because it's like basically saying to somebody, your name's not important, it's not important enough for me to learn and struggle with. We need to get on with the important things here. And actually, if you're not willing to learn somebody's name, it's very unlikely that they're going to want to give you additional information about themselves. So in the same way we try and do that with service users, we try and use their name, we should definitely be trying to do that with students. Going back to looking at the strengths perspective in terms of how we support our students, I want to just use the example of looking at one of the practice educators. One of the things that came up in the results, what we said was actually challenging racism can be quite difficult, because actually we expect that students will experience that post-qualification. But actually, it's not that we can change that, and it's not that you can remove that experience. But what you can do is you can look at it from a strengths perspective and credit the student with having excellent professionalism skills if they've managed to still work with that service user and offer them a service. So rather than it being a weakness, or rather than it being a negative thing, highlighting how professional that person must be and how committed to the PCFs that they must be, and turning it into a strength on their behalf. and also to be able to face adversity and still be able to, because majority of your BAME students would have faced some form of adversity because of the colour of their skin, turning that into a positive thing to look at how they are able to overcome adversity and still be able to be in a profession that champions the needs of others. And then also selecting learning opportunities that are appropriate for your students and also appropriate for yourself. So how can you learn about being able to support a BAME student? There's things that are available that through your organisation. And there's so many different podcasts that are available through Spotify, YouTube, all those things. And then also looking at learning opportunities. So if you know you're in a predominantly white area, and you're familiar with areas that are particularly racist, thinking about how you're going to support the student prior to going into that area and being open and explicit with that prior, so that the student knows if they do experience that, they have your back, that you have their back, and they're able to come back, and that you may have thought about giving them some tactics to use prior to going into that, so they're armed, knowing that yes, you've supported them in finding the right skills, but that you recognize that it's wrong and you want them to overcome that. So going back into the breakout rooms, we want to look at moving past just talking about things. What can we actually do to build an inclusive learning environment? Yeah, so you know the environments that you're working in, you know your working environments. So how do you explicitly plan for having minority ethnic students in relation to knowing the oppression that they face in society? So it's not, or have they experienced it? We know that this is a racist society, so we can more or less take it for granted that your student would have experienced racism. And knowing that they face that oppression, how are you going to support them in the workplace? And secondly, how can you address your conscious and unconscious bias towards minority ethnic students? Because we all have bias. How do you, or would you support a student who experienced racism whilst on placement? Because to know it in advance is to be able to, manage it better. And what do you need to be able to feel confident? So what do you need from us and your employers to be able to feel confident to openly acknowledge your ethnicity and the ethnicities of your students?
Hello everyone and welcome back. And we hope that you had some interesting and useful discussions in your group. As you can see, we're heading quickly towards the end at 3:30, so we're not going to have much opportunity for feeding back, but we hope that you found those group discussions useful and they started some useful conversations that you can carry on. And I just want to briefly hark back to the reflections that we started with, the kind of things we asked you to think about as we were going through. And so these are just things that we hoped that you might shift your thinking on at some point during our discussions today, or it might kind of spark some new thoughts for you. So we've just pretty much put them up for just a minute, just for you to think back to like how your race and your ethnicity affects and impacts on your practice generally, or as a practice educator, and for you to think about how ethnic minority students might experience working in your particular organisation and what the particular demographic of the organisation is. And of course, to reflect on how prepared you feel to support students who might be from an ethnic background that's different to your own. So we hope that some of our conversations and discussions today have shifted your thinking on that, or just prompted some thought on that. But unfortunately, we've got not much more time to discuss that. Hopefully there'll be opportunities in the future. But I want to pass you on to Jenny to close us out and to tell you about some things that you might, if you're interested, be able to get involved with and going forward.
Yeah, so one of the things that has come out of this project that we've been talking about today was the idea to create some book clubs in which we would spend time looking at books, but also films, podcasts, whatever we were interested in, that were written or produced by minority ethnic authors, filmmakers, or whatever, with the thoughts that sometimes we can't experience what life is like for somebody else, but we can hear their stories. And this is one way of hearing other people's stories. And so at the moment, we're just figuring out how we're going to do that. But if that's something that interests you and that you would like to be part of one of those groups, we're looking at running them in the different local authorities represented here. Then feel free to shoot us an email at the email address here. Don't worry, we'll send this out, so you don't have to scribble it down now, and we'll take note of your name and let you know when we get those set up. You shoot to the next slide, Polly. But if the thought of reading some narratives put out by minority ethnic authors is something that interests you right now, I have some suggestions that might interest you on this slide. And I also have a list I've put together, which I'm going to send out in a little while. They're not just super serious books that are full of doom and gloom, but there's some humour, some young adult books, if that's the sort of thing that interests you, things written from male perspectives, things written from female perspectives. So take a look at that if that's something that interests you. And that is it for everything we have to say. So just to say thank you so much for coming, everybody. It's really been great to have you here to hear your perspectives. We are going to be sending out a much more detailed report about what we found from the project that we've been talking about today. So if what we've said today interests you, take a look at that and see in much more detail what we've been talking about. We'll also send out a recording of today's webinar if you want to see it all again. Do feel free to get in touch with us if you have any questions or want to chat with us any further about anything we've talked about. But unless anyone else has anything to say, that's it from us.
Just to say also, please complete the feedback form. Sorry, Jenny, I'm not sure if you said that.
I forgot that, Polly. Thank you.
I think is that in the chat already? But that will also be coming out.
We'll send that out with the email we send out.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.